The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains as Felicity Parker rode faster than she'd ever dared, blood seeping through her fingers as she clutched her side. Behind her, the sound of hoofbeats had faded, but she couldn't risk slowing down, not with Blackwell's men still hunting her for what she'd witnessed at the saloon in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, 1876. The unforgiving summer heat beat down on her already feverish body as she pushed her exhausted mare forward. 3 days on the run had taken their toll, with barely any food and only muddy creek water to sustain her. The bullet had only grazed her, but without proper cleaning, the wound had festered, sending burning tendrils of infection throughout her body. Felicity's vision blurred as the rolling grasslands gave way to scattered pine trees. In the distance, a cabin came into view, smoke curling from its chimney. A ranch house. Safety, perhaps, or more danger. She had no way of knowing, but with her strength failing and her mare near collapse, she had no choice. The wooden gate marking the entrance to the property seemed to sway before her eyes as she approached. Her fingers loosened on the reins, the world tilting sideways as the fever claimed her consciousness. The last thing Felicity felt was her body sliding from the saddle, the hard ground rushing up to meet her as darkness claimed her vision. Xavier James had been splitting wood when he heard the approaching horse. Living alone on the edge of settled territory made him cautious of unexpected visitors. He set down his axe and reached for the Winchester rifle he kept nearby, eyes narrowed as he watched the rider approach. The woman was clearly struggling to stay mounted. Even from a distance, he could see she was swaying dangerously in the saddle. When she collapsed at his gate, Xavier didn't hesitate. He ran toward her, rifle abandoned beside the woodpile. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" He knelt beside her still form, noting her flushed face and the alarming heat radiating from her skin. Then he spotted the blood-stained fabric at her side. "Damnation," he muttered, looking around quickly to ensure she hadn't been followed. The vast Montana landscape remained empty except for her exhausted horse, which stood with head lowered and flanks heaving. Xavier made his decision quickly. With gentle but efficient movements, he gathered the unconscious woman into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her full riding skirt and blouse. "You're burning up something fierce," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Her face, despite being smudged with dirt and drawn with pain, struck him as uncommonly beautiful. Auburn hair had come loose from its pins, framing features that seemed almost delicate against the harsh backdrop of the wilderness. Xavier carried her through the gate and up to his cabin, kicking the door open with his boot. Inside, the modest dwelling was neat and orderly, unexpected for a man living alone on the frontier. He placed her carefully on his bed, then hurried to retrieve her horse and his rifle before anyone else came along the trail. After securing the mare in his small stable with fresh water and hay, Xavier returned to tend to his unexpected guest. As a rancher who'd survived a decade in Montana Territory, he'd developed rudimentary medical skills out of necessity. The woman remained unconscious as he gently examined the wound at her side. "You've got yourself in a bad way, miss," he murmured, noting the angry red infection surrounding what appeared to be a bullet graze. He gathered clean cloths, his bottle of whiskey, and a basin of water, then hesitated. Propriety demanded he respect her modesty, but the wound needed cleaning. With a sigh, he carefully unbuttoned just enough of her blouse to access the injury, keeping her covered as much as possible. The woman moaned when the whiskey touched the wound, her eyelids fluttering briefly before stilling again. Xavier worked methodically, cleaning away the dirt and dried blood, then applying a poultice of herbs he'd learned to use from an old trapper who'd once saved his life after a grisly attack. Night fell as Xavier completed his ministrations, wrapping a clean bandage around her midsection. He built up the fire in the hearth, then settled into the wooden chair beside the bed, rifle across his knees. He didn't know who this woman was or what trouble might be following her, but he'd stand guard until he found out. "Don't you worry," he told her sleeping form. "No one's getting through that door tonight." Felicity drifted in and out of consciousness, caught in a haze of fever dreams and fragmented memories. Sometimes she was back in Boston, her father scolding her for refusing yet another suitable suitor. Other times she was in Silver Creek, witnessing Judge Holloway's murder all over again, seeing the shock on his face as Blackwell's men gunned him down for refusing to be bought. Occasionally, she became aware of a deep voice speaking soothingly, of strong hands adjusting a cool cloth on her forehead, of being helped to sip water. Once, she opened her eyes to find a man with concerned blue eyes watching her, but before she could speak, darkness claimed her again. When she finally awoke fully, pale morning light was filtering through a small window. Felicity blinked, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The rough-hewn logs of the cabin ceiling came into focus, and she became aware of the soft bed beneath her, the clean smell of the linens. Attempting to sit up brought a sharp stab of pain from her side, drawing a gasp from her lips. "Easy there," came a low voice from nearby. "That wound's still pretty angry." Felicity turned her head to find a man rising from a chair beside the bed. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble. His blue eyes regarded her with a mixture of concern and wariness. "Where am I?" she managed, her voice hoarse from disuse. "My ranch." About 30 miles northeast of Silver Creek. He moved to pour water from a pitcher into a cup. "You collapsed outside my gate 3 days ago. Been pretty much out of your head with fever since then. 3 days. Felicity accepted the cup with shaking hands, the cool water a blessing against her parched throat. "Name's Xavier James," he said, watching her carefully. "Most folks around here call me X." "Felicity Parker," she replied automatically, then winced, wondering if she should have used a false name. If Blackwell's men were still searching for her. "That bullet wound wasn't from hunting accident," Xavier observed, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "You in some kind of trouble, Miss Parker?" Felicity hesitated, weighing her options. This man had saved her life, tended her wound, and by the looks of the pillow and blanket near the hearth, given up his bed for her comfort while he kept watch. She owed him the truth, or at least part of it. "I witnessed something I shouldn't have in Silver Creek," she said carefully. "Men who work for someone powerful. They've been hunting me since." Xavier nodded, accepting this without pressing for details. "You're safe here for now. No one's been by, and I doubt anyone followed your trail through that thunderstorm we had the night you arrived." "I can't stay," Felicity protested, though the mere thought of moving exhausted her. "I've put you in danger just by being here." "Madam, you couldn't make it to the outhouse right now, let alone anywhere else." His voice held no mockery, just plain truth. "That infection nearly killed you. You need rest, good food, and time to heal." As if to underscore his words, a wave of dizziness washed over Felicity, and she sank back against the pillows. "I don't want to impose," she said weakly. A ghost of a smile touched Xavier's lips. "Been living alone out here for 5 years. Can't say having company is an imposition." He took the empty cup from her trembling fingers. "I've got stew on the stove. Think you could manage some?" Felicity nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. As Xavier moved to the fireplace where a pot bubbled, she took the opportunity to look around the cabin. It was simple but well built, with a table and chairs, a bookshelf surprisingly full of volumes, the fireplace, and the bed she occupied. Everything was neat and organized, not what she'd expected from a bachelor rancher living on the frontier. "You live here alone?" she asked as he returned with a bowl of fragrant stew. Xavier helped her sit up, arranging pillows behind her back. "Just me and about 60 head of cattle plus my horses." He handed her the bowl and a spoon. "Came out here after the war, wanted open space and quiet." Felicity took a cautious bite of the stew, surprised by the rich flavor. "This is delicious." "Man can't survive on hardtack and coffee," he said with a shrug. "Had to learn." As she ate, Felicity became uncomfortably aware of her state. Her hair felt tangled and dirty, and though someone, presumably Xavier, had cleaned the blood and dirt from her face and hands, she desperately needed a proper wash. "My horse?" she asked, changing the subject from her embarrassing condition. "Mare's fine. Exhausted and hungry when you arrived, but she's recovering in the stable." He settled back in the chair. "Your saddlebags are there too. Didn't go through them, figured that was your business." Felicity felt a surge of gratitude. The evidence that had cost Judge Holloway his life was still safely hidden in her saddlebags, sewn into the lining where Blackwell's men wouldn't think to look. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything. Most men wouldn't have bothered with a stranger." Xavier's expression darkened slightly. "Seen too much death already in my life. No need to add another soul to that tally if I can help it." He stood and took the empty bowl. "You should rest. I'll be outside tending to the stock. Call if you need anything." After he left, Felicity sank back against the pillows, mind racing despite her exhaustion. She needed to get the evidence to the federal marshal in Helena, but she was in no condition to travel. For now, she was at the mercy of this quiet, capable stranger who'd saved her life. She could only hope his kindness wouldn't cost him his own. Outside, Xavier leaned against the stable wall, watching his small herd graze in the distance. The woman's presence complicated things. He'd built his life here specifically to avoid complications, to escape the memories of Antietam and Gettysburg that still haunted his dreams. The solitude of ranch life had been his salvation after the war left him with scars both visible and hidden. Now there was a beautiful, wounded woman in his bed, clearly running from dangerous men. The sensible thing would be to help her recover enough to travel, then send her on her way. But something in her determined green eyes stirred feelings he'd thought long buried beneath years of solitude. Xavier shook his head, pushing away such thoughts. For now, he had a ranch to run and a woman to protect. Whatever came after, he'd face when it arrived. The next few days established a careful routine. Xavier would rise at dawn, tend to his livestock, then prepare breakfast for them both. Felicity grew stronger each day, the fever receding as the infection gradually healed. By the 4th day of her conscious recovery, she was able to sit at the table for meals, and even managed a tentative walk around the cabin with Xavier's steadying hand at her elbow. On the 5th day, when Xavier returned from his morning chores, he found Felicity standing at the wash basin, her auburn hair loose down her back as she attempted to wash her face one-handed, the other arm protecting her injured side. "You should have called for help," he said, setting down the bucket of fresh water he'd brought in. Felicity jumped slightly, a blush spreading across her cheeks. "I've imposed enough. Besides, I desperately needed to feel clean." Xavier studied her, noting the color returning to her face and the clearer look in her eyes. "There's a stream about 50 yards behind the cabin. Water's cold but clean. If you're feeling up to it, I could. That is, I could carry some water for a proper bath, give you some privacy." The blush deepened, but Felicity nodded gratefully. That would be wonderful. An hour later, Xavier had filled his largest metal tub with water warmed on the stove, set up a screen made from a blanket hung on a rope, and tactfully retreated to chop wood at a distance that allowed him to keep watch over the cabin while giving Felicity privacy. The luxury of warm water against her skin was almost enough to make Felicity weep with gratitude. She washed away days of fever and fear, careful of the healing wound at her side. As she bathed, she contemplated her situation. Xavier James was unlike any man she'd ever known. In Boston, she'd been pursued by ambitious young men attracted to her father's banking fortune. In Silver Creek, where she'd gone to teach at the newly established school, the local men had viewed her as either a delicate Eastern flower or a potential conquest. But Xavier treated her with a respectful consideration that demanded nothing in return. Yet, there was something in his eyes, sometimes a shadow of old pain, perhaps, or a loneliness that matched her own. Whatever had driven him to this solitary existence had left its mark. By the time Xavier returned to the cabin, Felicity had dressed in clean clothes from her saddlebags, a simple skirt and blouse that had survived her desperate flight. She'd managed to brush and braid her hair, though the effort had left her tired and her side aching. "You look better," Xavier observed, setting down an armload of firewood. "More like yourself, I imagine." "I feel human again," she admitted, "though I fear I've used all your hot water and soap. Small price to pay." His eyes lingered on her for a moment before he turned to stoke the fire. "Figured you might be ready to tell me what kind of trouble you're in. Might help to know what we're dealing with." Felicity sank into a chair, considering how much to reveal. "Have you heard of a man named Jacob Blackwell?" Xavier's expression hardened. cattle baron with land southeast of here. Has the county officials in his pocket and a reputation for dealing harshly with anyone who crosses him. He's more than that, Felicity said quietly. He's been running a land fraud scheme, forcing settlers off their claims with his men, then filing forged paperwork. Judge Holloway discovered evidence of it and was preparing to notify federal authorities. Heard the judge was killed in a robbery gone wrong at the Silver Creek Bank, Xavier said, his tone indicating he'd suspected otherwise. It was no robbery. I was at the courthouse late, grading papers in my classroom. I overheard Blackwell threatening the judge then his men shot him. They didn't know I was there until I knocked over a lamp trying to escape. Felicity's hands trembled at the memory. The judge had given me papers to hold for him the day before, said they were important. I didn't know what they were until after I saw him murdered. Xavier sat across from her, his expression grave. And now Blackwell's men are hunting you for those papers. Felicity nodded. I need to get them to the federal marshal in Helena, but I couldn't outrun Blackwell's men. They caught up with me on the third day. One of them grazed me with a bullet before I managed to lose them in the hills. That's 100 miles to Helena, Xavier pointed out. Dangerous journey even without men hunting you, I know, but Judge Holloway died trying to expose Blackwell's crimes. I can't let that be for nothing. Felicity met his gaze steadily. Once I'm strong enough, I have to try. Xavier was silent for a long moment, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. You're either the bravest or the most foolhardy woman I've ever met, he finally said. Probably both. I'm a schoolteacher from Boston who came west looking for adventure, Felicity said with a rueful smile. Foolhardy seems accurate. Well, you're not going anywhere for at least another week, Xavier declared. That wound needs more healing and you need your strength back. He stood, decision apparently made. After that, we'll figure out how to get you safely to Helena. Felicity's heart skipped. Mr. James, I couldn't ask you to. You didn't ask. I'm offering. His tone brooked no argument. And it's Xavier or X if you prefer. Mr. James was my father and we weren't on speaking terms even before he passed. Felicity wanted to protest further, to insist she wouldn't endanger him by involving him in her problems. But the truth was she needed help, and the thought of facing Blackwell's men alone again terrified her. Thank you. Xavier, she said softly. He nodded once, then changed the subject. Think you're up to helping with dinner. Nothing strenuous, just sitting at the table peeling potatoes. Might be good for you to do something besides lie in bed. The domestic simplicity of the suggestion almost made Felicity laugh after the intensity of their conversation. I believe I can manage potatoes without reopening my wound. As they worked side by side preparing the evening meal, Felicity felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over her. For the first time since witnessing Judge Holloway's murder, she didn't feel completely alone. That night, despite Xavier's protests, Felicity insisted he reclaim his bed while she took the pallet by the fire. You've been sleeping in that chair for over a week, she pointed out. You need proper rest too. Eventually, he relented, though he placed his rifle within easy reach of his bed and positioned himself between Felicity and the door. The protective gesture wasn't lost on her as she drifted off to sleep, feeling safer than she had in weeks. In the days that followed, Felicity regained her strength more rapidly than either of them expected. The fresh air and simple but nutritious food helped, as did the absence of constant fear. She began helping with small chores around the cabin, careful not to overtax herself but determined not to be a burden. Xavier proved to be a man of surprising depths. Though quiet by nature, he was well-read. His bookshelf containing volumes of poetry, philosophy, and history, alongside practical guides to ranching and veterinary care. In the evenings, they discussed books they'd both read, exchanging perspectives that often revealed more about each other than direct questions would have. She learned he'd fought for the Union, rising to the rank of captain before being wounded at Gettysburg. He spoke little of the war itself, but Felicity sensed the memories haunted him still. He'd come west afterward, working as a cowhand before saving enough to purchase his own small spread 5 years ago. For his part, Xavier discovered that beneath Felicity's refined Boston upbringing lay a woman of remarkable courage and principles. She defied her father's wishes to become a teacher, believing education was the foundation of a better society. Her decision to accept a position in the Montana Territory had been driven by both idealism and a desire to escape the stifling expectations of Boston society. On the 10th day after her arrival, Xavier found Felicity outside, cautiously leading her mare around the small corral. The horse, now recovered from its exhaustion, nudged affectionately at her mistress's shoulder. "She's looking better," Xavier observed, leaning against the fence. "What's her name?" "Liberty," Felicity replied with a smile, stroking the mare's neck. "My small act of rebellion when my father insisted ladies should only ride side-saddle on docile horses with appropriate names like Daisy or Blossom." Xavier chuckled, the sound warming Felicity more than the spring sunshine. "Suits her. She carried you a long way." "Yes, she did." Felicity's expression sobered. "I've been thinking about Helena. The spring cattle drive season will be starting soon. There might be groups heading north that we could join for safety." "Already ahead of you," Xavier said. "Rode over to the Wilkins place yesterday while you were resting. Ben Wilkins is taking a small herd to the railroad at Helena next week. Says we're welcome to ride along." "You've already arranged it." Felicity was surprised both by his foresight and the confirmation that he intended to accompany her. Xavier shrugged. "Seemed the safest way. Blackwell's men won't easily attack a group of armed drovers." "I don't know how to thank you," Felicity said, suddenly overwhelmed by his kindness. "No need for thanks." He stepped into the corral, coming to stand beside her. "Truth is, I've been thinking about selling some stock in Helena anyway. Good prices this time of year." They both knew it was a convenient excuse, but Felicity accepted it without challenge. "Then it seems we'll be traveling companions." "Seems so." Xavier's gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he turned his attention to Liberty. "She'll be ready for the journey. You've both recovered well." That evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, a comfortable silence between them, Felicity found herself studying Xavier's profile. The firelight cast shadows that emphasized his strong features: the straight nose, firm jaw, and expressive eyes currently focused on the book in his hands. There was a solidity to him, a quiet strength that made her feel secure in a way she'd never experienced. "Why did you help me?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Xavier looked up from his book, seemingly unsurprised by the sudden inquiry. "What kind of man would I be if I left an injured woman to die on my doorstep?" "Many would have, especially knowing it might bring trouble." Felicity persisted. "You didn't just save me. You've cared for me, protected me, and now you're risking your life to help me reach Helena." Xavier was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the fire. "During the war, I saw too many people turn away from those who needed help. Men left to die because stopping to aid them might endanger others." His voice grew quiet. "I promised myself I wouldn't become that person, someone who chooses safety over doing what's right." He set his book aside, meeting her eyes directly. "But if I'm honest, there's more to it than that. From the moment I carried you through that door, something changed. This cabin's been just a place I exist, but these past days, it's felt like a home." The simple honesty of his words touched Felicity deeply. "I've felt it too," she admitted softly. "This sense of belonging. Even with the circumstances being what they are." Xavier's expression softened, vulnerability showing through his usual reserved demeanor. "I've been alone a long time, Felicity. Chose it that way after the war, easier than risking more loss." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "But these days with you, I'm remembering what it's like to care about someone again. And that terrifies me almost as much as Blackwell's men." Felicity's heart beat faster at his confession. "I understand," she said. "I came west partly to escape my father's attempts to marry me off to suitable Boston gentlemen. I told myself I wanted independence, not attachment. Yet here I am, finding myself drawn to a Montana rancher I've known barely 2 weeks." A smile touched Xavier's lips. "Life has strange ways of appending our plans." "Indeed it does." Felicity hesitated, then reached across the space between them to touch his hand. "Whatever happens in Helena, I'm grateful for these days here. They've meant more than I can express." Xavier turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "We should get some rest. The journey ahead will be demanding." But neither moved immediately, both reluctant to break the connection that had formed between them, a connection that transcended their unexpected circumstances and spoke to something deeper, something neither had been looking for but had found nonetheless. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool, with the promise of warmth as the sun rose higher. Xavier had spent the previous days preparing, selecting 10 head of cattle to drive to Helena along with Wilkins's larger herd, and ensuring both their horses were well rested and properly shod for the journey. Felicity had packed her few belongings, including the crucial documents still hidden in her saddlebag lining. She'd mended her clothes as best she could and helped Xavier prepare travel rations. Though still tender, her wound had healed remarkably well, leaving what would eventually be a small scar along her ribs. "Ready?" Xavier asked as he finished securing their supplies to the packhorse. Felicity nodded, adjusting her hat against the morning sun. She wore her split riding skirt and a practical blouse, with a man's canvas jacket Xavier had altered to fit her smaller frame. A small revolver also, Xavier's, was tucked into a holster at her waist, after he'd insisted she take it, and spent an afternoon teaching her to shoot with reasonable accuracy. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, mounting Liberty with only a slight wince as the movement pulled at her healing side. They rode east toward the Wilkins ranch, leading the small group of cattle. Xavier had selected young steers that were relatively easy to drive. But even so, Felicity quickly gained new respect for the skill involved in moving livestock across open country. By midday, they reached the Wilkins property, where Ben Wilkins and his 3 hands were already gathering their larger herd. Wilkins was a weathered man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard and shrewd eyes that assessed Felicity carefully. "So you're the schoolteacher who's got Blackwell's outfit in a lather," he said after introductions were made. "Heard they've been asking questions all through the county." Felicity exchanged a concerned glance with Xavier. "They're still searching then," Wilkins nodded, offering a reward too. "But don't you worry, no one in these parts has much love for Blackwell or his methods. Most folks are happy to send his men on wild goose chases." "We appreciate you letting us join your drive," Xavier said. "Glad for the extra hands," Wilkins replied pragmatically. "We leave at first light tomorrow. Should make Helena in 5 days if the weather holds and the streams aren't running too high." That night, they camped with Wilkins's outfit, sleeping under the stars. Felicity lay awake for some time, watching the vast expanse of the Montana sky, brilliant with stars untainted by city smoke. Xavier's bedroll was nearby, his presence reassuring as he took his turn at watch, rifle across his knees. She thought about the journey ahead, and what awaited in Helena: the confrontation with authority, the danger of Blackwell's influence, the uncertainty of whether justice would prevail. And beneath those immediate concerns lay deeper questions about her future, about the feelings growing between her and Xavier, about what might be possible once her mission was completed. The cattle drive began at dawn, with Wilkins's experienced hands taking the lead and Xavier and Felicity helping to keep the combined herd moving steadily northward. The work was demanding but straightforward, with each day following a similar pattern: early starts, long hours in the saddle, and evenings spent around the campfire recovering from the day's exertions. Felicity quickly proved her worth, her natural affinity with horses making up for her lack of cattle driving experience. By the 3rd day, even Wilkins's most skeptical hand, a grizzled cowboy named Harley, grudgingly acknowledged her contribution. "Not bad for a schoolmarm," he commented as they shared coffee during the evening meal. "Most Eastern ladies would have quit by now." "I'm not most ladies," Felicity replied with a smile, gratefully accepting the plate of beans and salt pork Xavier handed her. "That's for certain," Xavier agreed, his eyes warm as they met hers. The moment of connection wasn't lost on Wilkins, who exchanged knowing glances with his men. By now, the entire outfit had pieced together that Felicity was carrying evidence against Blackwell, though none had asked for details. The rancher's corrupt practices had affected many in the territory, and the chance to see him face justice was motivation enough to protect her. On the fourth day, as they approached a narrow pass between two ridges, Wilkins called a halt, his expression concerned as he studied the terrain ahead. "Don't like it," he said to Xavier. "Too easy for an ambush. We should scout ahead before taking the herd through." Xavier nodded in agreement. "I'll go." "I'll come with you," Felicity volunteered immediately. "No," Xavier's tone was firm. "If there's trouble, you're the one they want. You'll stay with the herd where it's safer." Before Felicity could argue, Wilkins intervened. "He's right, Miss Parker. Besides, we need someone with a good eye to watch the south approach while we're focused ahead." Reluctantly, Felicity agreed, though she watched anxiously as Xavier and one of Wilkins's hands, a young cowboy named Tom, rode toward the pass. They returned an hour later, expressions grim, signs of riders, Xavier reported. At least 4, maybe 6. "They've been watching the pass, but moved on not long ago, heading east. Blackwell's men?" Felicity asked, fear tightening her chest. "Can't be sure, but it seems likely." Xavier dismounted beside her. "They may have gotten word of the drive and are checking possible routes to Helena." Wilkins stroked his beard thoughtfully. "We could divert west, take the longer trail through the foothills. Add 2 days to the journey at least," his foreman pointed out. "Or we could split up," Xavier suggested. "You take the herd through as planned. Felicity and I will go north through Elk Basin, then east to Helena. Rougher country, but less likely to be watched." Wilkins considered this, then nodded slowly. "Might be the safest option. You know that country well enough," Xavier confirmed. "We'll travel light, move faster without the cattle." The decision made, they quickly redistributed supplies. Xavier and Felicity would take their horses and one pack horse, carrying only essentials. They'd leave Xavier's cattle with Wilkins to be sold in Helena, with the proceeds held until Xavier could claim them. As they prepared to part ways, Wilkins pulled Xavier aside. "Watch yourself, James. Blackwell doesn't forgive those who cross him." "I'm aware," Xavier replied grimly. "But some things are worth the risk." They set out immediately, riding north away from the cattle drive as the afternoon sun began its descent. The new route would take them through rougher terrain, densely forested hills, and narrow valleys where horses could pass, but wagons and large groups would struggle. "I'm sorry," Felicity said, as they made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow. "You wouldn't be in this danger if not for me." Xavier looked up from where he was building a small, nearly smokeless fire. "I made my choice, Felicity, no regrets. Still, you've given up so much, left your home unattended, risked your cattle, put yourself in Blackwell's sights. The ranch will be there when I return," he said simply. As for Blackwell, his expression hardened. Men like him maintain power because good people are afraid to stand against them. It's time someone did. Felicity studied him in the growing firelight, seeing the determination in his features. "You're a remarkable man, Xavier James." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Not remarkable, just doing what needs doing." He hesitated, then added more softly, "and protecting what matters." The warmth in his eyes as he said this made Felicity's heart beat faster. In that moment, the dangers they faced seemed distant compared to the growing connection between them, a connection neither had anticipated but both increasingly treasured. They traveled cautiously for the next 2 days, avoiding open ground and keeping to the cover of forests and ravines. The route was demanding, requiring them to lead the horses on foot through some sections, but they encountered no sign of pursuit. By nightfall on the second day, Xavier estimated they were less than a day's ride from Helena. "We should reach the city by tomorrow afternoon," he said as they made camp in a small clearing. "From there, we'll need to locate the federal marshal's office immediately." Felicity nodded, relief mixing with a new anxiety. Once the evidence was delivered, her task would be complete, but what would come after? Would Xavier return to his ranch? Would she resume teaching somewhere? The questions had been circling in her mind with increasing frequency. "What will you do after?" she asked, voicing the thought that troubled her most. "When this is finished," Xavier was silent for a long moment, feeding small branches to their fire. "Haven't thought that far ahead," he finally said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Return to the ranch, I suppose." "It's planting season soon." "Of course," Felicity said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "And I should seek a new teaching position, perhaps in Helena itself." Xavier looked up, meeting her gaze across the fire. "Is that what you want, to stay in Helena?" "I don't know what I want," she admitted, "except," she hesitated, gathering courage, "except that I've come to care for you, Xavier, more than I expected, more than might be wise given our circumstances." The firelight caught the emotion that crossed his face, surprise, followed by something deeper, more intense. "Felicity." He set down the branch he was holding and moved around the fire to sit beside her. "These past weeks have changed me, changed how I see my life, my future." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "I thought I wanted solitude, convinced myself it was safer than risking attachment, but being with you even with the danger, even with the uncertainty, has felt more right than all those years alone." Felicity's heart soared at his words. "I feel the same," she whispered. "When I came west, I was running away from one life without really knowing what I was running toward. Now I think perhaps I was finding my way to you." Xavier's free hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "I don't have much to offer. Just a small ranch and a simple life, but if that's enough." "It's everything," Felicity assured him, leaning into his touch. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened as months of loneliness and days of growing affection converged in a moment of connection that felt both surprising and inevitable. When they finally parted, Xavier rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips. "Whatever happens in Helena," he murmured, "we'll face it together." Felicity nodded, a sense of peace settling over her despite the dangers still ahead. For the first time since fleeing Silver Creek, she allowed herself to truly hope for a future beyond mere survival, a future that now, she prayed, would include the remarkable man beside her. Dawn brought low clouds and the threat of rain as they broke camp and continued their journey toward Helena. The terrain gradually became less rugged, giving way to rolling hills and eventually the wider valley where Montana's territorial capital had been established. By early afternoon, they caught their first glimpse of the growing city nestled along the banks of the Missouri River. "We made it," Felicity said, relief evident in her voice as they paused on a ridge overlooking Helena. Xavier nodded, though his expression remained vigilant. "Not safely home yet. Blackwell likely has connections here too. We need to move carefully." They approached the city from the northwest, avoiding the main roads until they reached the outskirts. Helena in 1876 was a bustling place, having grown rapidly since gold was discovered in Last Chance Gulch just over a decade earlier. Though the initial gold rush had subsided, the city had established itself as an important commercial and governmental center for the territory. Xavier led them to a modest boarding house several blocks from the city center, where they secured rooms and stabled their horses. The establishment was run by a widow named Mrs. Hollister, who asked no questions beyond their names and how long they intended to stay. "One night, possibly two," Xavier told her, paying in advance from the limited funds they carried. Once they had washed away the dust of travel and changed into their cleanest remaining clothes, they set out for the federal marshal's office. Felicity carried the evidence documents securely inside her jacket, her hand occasionally touching the hidden pocket to reassure herself they were still there. The streets of Helena were busy with afternoon traffic merchants, miners, settlers, and government officials going about their business. Xavier kept close to Felicity, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of threat. They located the federal building without difficulty, a substantial stone structure that housed various territorial offices. Inside, they inquired after Marshal Robert Daniels, only to learn he was currently out of the city, investigating reports of cattle rustling near the Bitterroot Valley. "When is he expected to return?" Xavier asked the clerk, frustration evident in his voice. "Tomorrow or the day after," the young man replied. "His deputy, Mr. Chambers, is available if it's urgent, Xavier and Felicity exchanged glances, silently debating whether to trust the deputy with such sensitive information. Is there somewhere private we could speak with Deputy Chambers? Felicity asked, making her decision. The clerk showed them to a small office where, moments later, they were joined by a serious-looking man in his 30s with a deputy marshal's badge pinned to his vest. William Chambers listened intently as Felicity explained the situation, producing the documents that detailed Blackwell's land fraud scheme and connected him to Judge Holloway's murder. "These are serious accusations against a powerful man," Chambers said when she finished, examining the papers with a frown. "Judge Holloway was well respected. His murder caused quite a stir even here in Helena. Will you act on this evidence?" Xavier asked directly. Chambers looked up, his expression grave. "I'll need to consult with Marshal Daniels when he returns, but yes, I believe we will. In the meantime, you should both remain in Helena. You'll need to provide formal statements once the Marshal returns." "Blackwell's men are searching for Miss Parker," Xavier pointed out. "They've already tried to kill her once." "I understand your concern," Chambers said. "I can arrange for a deputy to keep watch near your lodgings until the Marshal returns. Beyond that, I suggest you maintain a low profile and avoid public places." It wasn't the immediate action they'd hoped for, but it was better than dismissal. They left the federal building with mixed feelings: relief that the evidence was now in official hands, but concern about the delay and the continued danger. "At least the documents are safe now," Felicity observed as they walked cautiously back toward their boarding house, taking a circuitous route through side streets. "True," Xavier agreed. "But I'd feel better once Blackwell is in custody. Until then, we need to remain vigilant." They spent the remainder of the day in the relative safety of the boarding house, taking their evening meal in the small dining room Mrs. Hollister provided for her guests. The only other diners were an elderly couple and a traveling salesman who paid them little attention. As they were finishing their meal, the front door opened, admitting a well-dressed man who spoke briefly with Mrs. Hollister before approaching their table. Xavier tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip, but the man stopped at a respectful distance and addressed them politely. "Miss Parker, Mr. James, my name is Thomas Grant. I'm an attorney here in Helena." He produced a card as identification. "Deputy Chambers asked me to consult with you regarding your testimony against Jacob Blackwell." Xavier relaxed slightly but remained wary. "How do we know you're who you claim to be?" Grant nodded approvingly at the caution. "A wise question." "Deputy Chambers mentioned you would be staying at this establishment, and said to tell you that the evidence you provided included land deed forgeries dated March 15th, a detail not shared with anyone else." This specific information, which matched the documents Felicity had turned over, convinced them of Grant's legitimacy. They invited him to join them, and over coffee, the attorney explained his involvement. "I've been building a case against Blackwell for months," Grant revealed. "Judge Holloway had corresponded with me about his suspicions, but we lacked concrete evidence until now. Your documents could be the key to finally bringing charges that will stick." "Why hasn't Blackwell been prosecuted before?" Felicity asked. "Surely his methods have raised suspicions previously." Grant's expression turned grim. "He's careful, works through intermediaries, maintains plausible deniability, and he has friends in high places: territorial legislators, business leaders who benefit from his operations. Previous attempts to investigate him have mysteriously lost momentum. But this time will be different." Xavier sounded skeptical. "This time we have direct evidence linking him to Judge Holloway's murder, plus the judge's own documentation of the land fraud." "And," Grant added with satisfaction, "we have an eyewitness." Felicity felt the weight of that role settle on her shoulders. "When will Marshal Daniels return?" A telegram was sent. "He should be back by tomorrow afternoon." "We'll need to move quickly after that. Blackwell undoubtedly has informants in Helena who will alert him once formal proceedings begin." After Grant departed, Xavier and Felicity returned to their rooms, which were adjacent but separated by a thin wall. Despite their physical proximity, Felicity felt a new distance between them, as the reality of their situation reasserted itself. The comfortable intimacy they'd developed during their journey seemed suddenly fragile in the face of what lay ahead. A soft knock at her door drew her from these thoughts. She opened it to find Xavier standing there, his expression troubled. "May I come in?" "Just to talk," he added quickly, mindful of propriety. Felicity nodded, stepping aside to admit him. The small room offered only a bed and a single chair, which Xavier took while Felicity sat on the edge of the bed. "Something's bothering you," she observed. Xavier ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. "I don't trust this situation. Too many people now know we're here, know what we're doing. You think there's a leak, even among the authorities. I think Blackwell didn't get where he is without having eyes and ears in places like the marshal's office." Xavier leaned forward, his expression intense. "We should consider leaving Helena, Felicity. The evidence is delivered. Your obligation is fulfilled." Felicity shook her head firmly. "I can't leave, Xavier. As Mr. Grant said, I'm the eyewitness. Without my testimony, the documents alone might not be enough, especially if Blackwell has the influence we suspect." "Your testimony won't matter if you're dead," Xavier said bluntly. "I've seen how men like Blackwell operate. They don't surrender power willingly, and they're most dangerous when cornered." "I know the risks," Felicity replied softly. "But Judge Holloway died trying to expose Blackwell's crimes. I owe it to him and to every settler who's been driven off their rightful land to see this through." Xavier studied her for a long moment, admiration mingling with frustration in his gaze. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." A small smile touched Felicity's lips. "So I've been told, usually by my father and never as a compliment." "It is from me," Xavier assured her, reaching across to take her hand. "But it doesn't stop me from worrying. I know." Felicity squeezed his fingers. "But we've come this far together. Let's finish what we started." Xavier nodded reluctantly. "Then we'll need to be even more careful until the marshal returns. No unnecessary movements outside this building. And tonight," he hesitated, "tonight I'll keep watch." Felicity wanted to protest, to insist he needed rest too, but the determination in his eyes told her it would be futile. Instead, she simply nodded. "Wake me for the second half of the night. You need some sleep as well." After Xavier returned to his own room to collect his thoughts, Felicity prepared for bed, her mind reviewing the day's events. They were so close to achieving their goal, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. She was nearly asleep when a faint sound from outside her window brought her fully alert. Carefully, she rose and moved to the side of the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. In the dim light of the street lamps, she could make out two men standing in the shadows across the street, their attention focused on the boarding house. Heart pounding, Felicity slipped from her room and knocked softly on Xavier's door. He opened it immediately, fully dressed and alert, his rifle in hand. "There are men watching the house," she whispered. Xavier nodded grimly. "I saw them arrive about 20 minutes ago, 2 more around back." "Blackwell's men, seems likely. Question is, how did they find us so quickly?" His expression darkened. "Someone talked." Felicity felt a chill of fear. "What do we do?" "For now, nothing. They're just watching, probably waiting for instructions." Xavier guided her into his room, closing the door quietly. "The deputy chambers promised should have been here by now. His absence suggests we can't count on official protection. Should we try to leave? Find somewhere else to stay?" Xavier shook his head. "Too risky in the dark, with them already in position. Better to wait until morning when there are more people about." He indicated the chair by the window. "I'll keep watch. Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow may be demanding." Felicity hesitated, reluctant to leave him alone with this burden but recognizing the wisdom in his strategy. "Wake me in a few hours," she insisted again. "You need rest too." Xavier's expression softened slightly. "I will. Now go before Mrs. Hollister discovers us and decides we're morally compromised." Despite the tension, Felicity smiled at the quip before returning to her room. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by worries about what the morning would bring and whether Marshal Daniels would return in time to help them. She woke to gray dawn light and the sound of rain against her window. Rising quickly, she dressed in her most practical clothes, anticipating they might need to move fast. When she knocked on Xavier's door, he answered promptly, looking tired but alert. "They're still there," he reported quietly. "Changed shifts about an hour ago, but the watch continues." "Did you sleep at all?" Felicity asked, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. "Enough," he replied, which she took to mean very little. "Mrs. Hollister is up. I can smell coffee. Let's get some breakfast and consider our options." They descended to the dining room, where the landlady was indeed preparing the morning meal. Only one other guest was present, the traveling salesman from the previous evening, who nodded politely before returning to his newspaper. As they ate, Xavier outlined his thoughts in a low voice. "We need to get word to Deputy Chambers or Attorney Grant about our situation. The federal building is 8 blocks from here, too far to risk with Blackwell's men watching, but there's a telegraph office 3 blocks east that could send a message." Felicity nodded, keeping her expression calm despite her racing heart. "I could go. They're less likely to recognize me than you, especially if I borrow a shawl from Mrs. Hollister and keep my head covered." Xavier looked ready to object, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded reluctantly. "It might work, but at the first sign of trouble, you return immediately. Promise me, Felicity." "I promise," she agreed, though they both knew circumstances might make that impossible. They finished their meal in tense silence, then Felicity approached Mrs. Hollister with a request to borrow a shawl, explaining she needed to visit the telegraph office but was concerned about the rain. The landlady, a practical woman who asked few questions, readily provided one. With the dark shawl covering her distinctive auburn hair and partially obscuring her face, Felicity slipped out the back door of the boarding house, while Xavier created a small diversion at the front by loudly discussing stable arrangements for their horses. The strategy worked. She made it to the street unobserved and set out for the telegraph office, moving at a brisk but unremarkable pace among the morning pedestrians. The 3 blocks felt like miles, as Felicity constantly fought the urge to look over her shoulder. Rain continued to fall, which helped conceal her features but made the streets less crowded than she'd hoped. She was 1 block from the telegraph office when instinct made her glance into the window of a hardware store as she passed. In the reflection, she saw a man following her, his purposeful stride and focused expression setting him apart from other pedestrians. Blackwell's man, without doubt, heart pounding, Felicity quickened her pace slightly, mind racing through options. She couldn't lead him back to the boarding house, nor could she confront him directly. The telegraph office remained her best hope, but she needed to ensure her message was sent even if she was intercepted. Reaching the office, she stepped inside, relieved to find several customers already waiting. She took her place in line, removed a small notepad and pencil from her pocket, and quickly composed her message while appearing to simply pass the time. When her turn came, she approached the clerk with what she hoped was a calm demeanor. "I need to send an urgent message to Deputy Marshal Chambers at the federal building," she said quietly, sliding the paper across the counter along with payment. "Please tell him it concerns Jacob Blackwell." The clerk, a young man with spectacles, glanced at the message and then at Felicity with sudden interest. "Are you Miss Parker?" Startled, Felicity hesitated before nodding cautiously. "Marshal Daniels returned last night," the clerk informed her in a low voice. "He left word at all telegraph offices to notify him immediately if you or Mr. James made contact." Relief washed over Felicity. "Is he at the federal building now?" "Yes, madam. Arrived early this morning. Please send this right away," Felicity urged. "And is there a back exit I might use?" "I believe I was followed here." The clerk's eyes widened, but he nodded toward a door behind the counter. "Through there, then left down the hallway, leads to the alley behind the building." "Thank you," Felicity said fervently, already moving in that direction. The alley was narrow and muddy from the rain, but blessedly empty. Felicity moved quickly, keeping close to the buildings and avoiding the main streets as she made her way toward the federal building. Her pursuit of justice had suddenly become a race against Blackwell's men, with Xavier's safety as well as her own at stake. Meanwhile, Xavier had grown increasingly anxious as time passed with no sign of Felicity's return. When nearly an hour had elapsed, he made his decision. After checking that Blackwell's men were still maintaining their watch, he approached the traveling salesman who was preparing to depart. "Sir, I have a proposition that would be worth $20 to you," Xavier said quietly. The man, who had introduced himself as Harold Winters the previous evening, raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. I need a diversion, something to draw the attention of the men watching this house while I slip out the back." Winters studied him thoughtfully. "Those fellows across the street have been making me nervous since yesterday. Not the law, I take it." "No," Xavier confirmed. "They work for a man named Blackwell." Recognition flashed in Winters' eyes. "Jacob Blackwell, the cattle baron." When Xavier nodded, the salesman's expression hardened. "My brother lost his claim to Blackwell's strong-arm tactics last year, died of pneumonia in a tent because he had nowhere proper to shelter." He waved away the money Xavier offered. "Keep your cash. I'll give you your diversion, and gladly." 10 minutes later, Winters emerged from the boarding house with his sample cases, making an excessive show of loading them onto his wagon. As he worked, he accidentally dropped one case, spilling its contents across the wet street. His loud complaints and dramatic efforts to salvage his merchandise successfully drew the attention of Blackwell's watchers. Using the distraction, Xavier slipped out the back door and made his way through neighboring yards before reaching a parallel street. Moving quickly but without attracting attention, he headed toward the federal building, hoping Felicity had succeeded in contacting the authorities. He was within sight of his destination when he spotted her not at the federal building as he'd expected, but emerging from an alley 2 blocks away, clearly trying to remain inconspicuous. Relief at seeing her safe was immediately tempered by alarm, as he also noticed a man following her, hand concealed beneath his coat in a way that suggested a hidden weapon. Without hesitation, Xavier changed direction, increasing his pace to intercept them before they reached the more crowded street ahead. He approached from the side, timing his movement to place himself between Felicity and her pursuer just as the man began to close the distance to her. "That's far enough," Xavier said coldly, his hand resting openly on his holstered pistol as he faced Blackwell's man. The pursuer stopped, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation as he assessed the new threat. He was younger than Xavier had expected, perhaps 30, with the hard eyes of someone accustomed to violence. "This isn't your concern, mister," the man said, his voice deceptively casual. "Just having a word with the lady." "She's not interested in conversation," Xavier replied, keeping his body between the man and Felicity. "And Marshal Daniels is expecting us both at the federal building. Any delay might prompt him to send deputies looking." The mention of the marshal caused the man to hesitate, his eyes darting toward the nearby federal building. It was enough of an opening for Xavier to act. "Felicity, go," he said without taking his eyes off the threat. "Now." She moved immediately, hurrying toward the federal building while Xavier maintained his protective stance. The standoff continued for several tense seconds before Blackwell's man made his choice, backing away with a forced smile. "Another time," he said, the words carrying an unmistakable threat before he turned and disappeared into a side street. Only when he was certain the man was gone did Xavier follow Felicity, catching up to her just as she reached the steps of the federal building. She turned to him with relief evident in her expression. "Xavier, how did you find me?" "Luck," he said simply, guiding her inside with a hand at the small of her back. "Did you send the message?" "Better than that," Felicity replied. "Marshal Daniels returned last night. He's here now." They were directed to a spacious office on the second floor, where they found Marshal Daniels in conference with Deputy Chambers and Attorney Grant. Daniels was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years in the saddle and a penetrating gaze that seemed to evaluate them instantly. "Miss Parker, Mr. James," he greeted them, rising from behind his desk. "We've been anxious to speak with you." Over the next hour, they provided detailed statements, Felicity recounting what she'd witnessed at the courthouse in Silver Creek and their subsequent journey, Xavier describing the pursuit and their narrow escapes. Marshal Daniels listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing them to tell their story uninterrupted. "Based on your information and the evidence you provided," he said when they had finished, "I'm prepared to issue warrants for Jacob Blackwell and his associates." "Mr. Grant will file formal charges this afternoon. What about the men watching our boarding house?" Xavier asked. "And the one who followed Miss Parker this morning?" "I've already dispatched deputies to investigate," Daniels assured them. "But I'm concerned about your safety until Blackwell is in custody. He's not a man who surrenders easily." "We've seen that firsthand," Felicity acknowledged. "I'd like to offer you protection," the marshal continued. "We have a secure location where witnesses in sensitive cases sometimes stay." Xavier and Felicity exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them before Xavier spoke. "We appreciate the offer, Marshal, but I'd prefer to make our own arrangements if possible." Daniels studied him thoughtfully. "You don't entirely trust official channels." "Can't say I blame you, given what you've been through." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a folded document which he passed to Xavier. "This might help. It's a temporary deputy marshal appointment, gives you authority to act in an official capacity if needed." Xavier accepted the document with surprise. "Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me yet," Daniels replied grimly. "The next 48 hours will be the most dangerous. Once Blackwell realizes we're moving against him, he'll become desperate. I'd advise you both to leave Helena until the situation is resolved, but I suspect neither of you would agree to that." "We've come too far to step away now," Felicity confirmed. Daniels nodded, his expression suggesting he'd expected nothing less. "Then let's discuss how to keep you both alive until this is finished." The plan they developed was straightforward but effective. Rather than returning to the boarding house where Blackwell's men were watching, Xavier and Felicity would relocate to rooms above Grant's law office, which had a private entrance and was located near the federal building. Marshal Daniels would publicly announce the investigation into Blackwell's activities that afternoon, making it clear that key witnesses were under federal protection, a move designed to make Blackwell believe direct action against Felicity or Xavier would be futile. Meanwhile, deputies would be dispatched to Silver Creek with warrants for Blackwell and his closest associates. If all went as planned, the cattle baron would be in custody before he could organize any significant retaliation. "It's not without risk," Daniels acknowledged as they concluded their discussion, "but it's our best option given the circumstances." As they prepared to leave for their new accommodation, escorted by Deputy Chambers, Felicity found herself overcome by a sudden wave of emotion. After weeks of danger and uncertainty, justice for Judge Holloway was finally within reach. She felt Xavier's hand take hers, his quiet strength providing the anchor she needed. "We made it," he murmured, echoing her words from the previous day but with new meaning. "Together." The rooms above Grant's law office were modest but comfortable, with a small sitting area connecting two bedrooms. Large windows overlooked the street below, though heavy curtains allowed for privacy. From this vantage point, they could see the federal building 2 blocks away, where Marshal Daniels would soon make his announcement. Deputy Chambers left them with assurances that he or another deputy would be stationed nearby at all times. Though not visibly, they wanted Blackwell to believe Felicity and Xavier were less protected than they actually were, potentially drawing him into a trap if he attempted direct action. Once alone, Felicity sank onto a small sofa, the events of the morning catching up with her. "I can hardly believe we're here," she said softly, "that it's nearly over." Xavier sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "Not quite over yet. Blackwell still needs to be taken into custody." "Do you think he'll resist?" "Almost certainly," Xavier replied honestly. "Men like him don't surrender power willingly, but Marshal Daniels seems capable and the evidence against Blackwell is substantial." Felicity leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "And after?" "What happens after this is truly over." Xavier's arms slipped around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "That depends on you," he said quietly, "on what you want." "I want." Felicity hesitated, then continued with newfound certainty. "I want what we talked about that night by the fire. A life that makes sense, with purpose and meaning. And I want it with you, Xavier, if that's still what you want to. His answer came not in words, but in the gentle kiss he pressed to her lips, a kiss that held promise and certainty despite the uncertainties that still surrounded them. When they parted, his blue eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. "It's what I want more than anything," he assured her. "A life built together day by day. My ranch isn't much, but it could be a home, our home." "It already feels more like home than anywhere I've been," Felicity told him honestly. Their moment of connection was interrupted by commotion in the street below. Moving to the window, they watched as a crowd gathered outside the federal building, where Marshal Daniels had appeared on the steps to make his announcement. Even at this distance, his authoritative presence commanded attention as he formally declared the investigation into Jacob Blackwell's criminal activities. The news spread through the gathered citizens like wildfire, with reactions ranging from shock to vindicated satisfaction. Helena, like many territorial communities, had a complex relationship with powerful figures like Blackwell. Some benefited from his operations, while others suffered from his methods. "It's done," Xavier said quietly as Daniels concluded his statement. "No turning back now." Felicity felt a curious mixture of relief and apprehension. Now we wait. The waiting proved more difficult than either had anticipated. Hours passed with no word from Marshal Daniels or his deputies. They took their evening meal in the rooms, provided by Grant's housekeeper, and watched as the city's activities gradually quieted with the onset of night. Xavier maintained a vigilant presence near the windows, alternating his attention between the street below and Felicity's increasingly anxious movements around their temporary sanctuary. "Try to rest," he suggested gently as the clock approached midnight. "There's nothing more we can do tonight." Felicity shook her head, her restlessness evident in every line of her body. "I can't. Not until we know Blackwell has been arrested." Before Xavier could respond, a soft knock at the door brought them both to immediate alertness. Xavier drew his pistol and moved silently to position himself beside the door. "Who is it?" he called, his voice steady. "Deputy Chambers," came the reply. "With news." Xavier motioned for Felicity to stay back as he cautiously opened the door, relaxing only slightly when he confirmed the deputy's identity before admitting him. Chambers looked tired, his expression grave as he removed his hat. "Marshal Daniels wanted you informed immediately." The deputies reached Silver Creek, but Blackwell wasn't there. According to his foreman, he left yesterday morning for Helena, supposedly on business. Felicity felt a chill of foreboding. "He's here, in Helena." "We believe so," Chambers confirmed. "We're checking hotels and known associates, but so far there's no sign of him." Xavier's expression darkened. "He knows. Someone warned him about the investigation." "Marshal Daniels shares that concern," the deputy acknowledged. "He's doubled the watch around this building and the federal offices, but Blackwell is well connected and resourceful." "What about his men who were watching the boarding house?" Felicity asked. "Gone when our deputies arrived to question them." "The landlady said they left shortly after you did this morning." Chambers hesitated, then added reluctantly, "There's more. 2 of Blackwell's known associates were seen at the train station late this afternoon, purchasing tickets west." "He's planning to flee," Xavier realized. "Or setting a false trail while he deals with the immediate threat to his operations," Chambers suggested grimly. "Either way, the marshal wants you both to remain here under guard until Blackwell is located." After the deputy departed, promising to return with any developments, Xavier secured the door and turned to find Felicity standing by the window, her silhouette outlined against the dim light from the street lamps below. "You should move away from the window," he advised gently, joining her. "Too visible." Felicity nodded but didn't immediately move. "I keep thinking about Judge Holloway," she said softly. "About how he knew the risks but stood firm anyway. He believed the law could prevail against men like Blackwell, even out here where might often makes right." Xavier drew the curtains closed before responding. The judge was a good man, but good men need protection sometimes, especially from those who see the law as an inconvenience rather than a foundation. "Is that why you became a deputy marshal?" Felicity asked, gesturing to the document Daniels had given him, which now rested on the small table. "I became a deputy to protect you," Xavier corrected her. "The law is just a tool for that purpose." Felicity turned to face him fully, her expression earnest in the lamplight. "You've protected me from the moment I collapsed at your gate, without asking for anything in return, without hesitation." Xavier's hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "Not entirely without self-interest," he admitted. "You brought something into my life I didn't realize was missing. Purpose. Connection." He paused, his voice softening. "Hope." Felicity leaned into his touch, her heart full despite the uncertainty of their situation. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered, "I'm grateful for these weeks with you. They've changed me too." Their kiss was deeper this time, a connection that acknowledged both the danger that still surrounded them and the future they hoped to claim together. When they finally parted, Xavier pressed his forehead to hers, his voice a low promise in the quiet room. "When this is over, when Blackwell is behind bars and you've given your testimony, I want to take you home, Felicity. To my ranch, our ranch, build a life there together." "Yes," she agreed simply, certainty filling her despite all they had yet to face. "Yes." They separated reluctantly, each retiring to their assigned bedroom with the promise of morning and perhaps resolution ahead. Sleep came fitfully to Felicity, her dreams filled with fragments of their journey and shadowy threats that lurked just beyond her vision. She woke to pale dawn light and the sound of activity in the sitting room. Rising quickly, she dressed and found Xavier already alert, a fresh pot of coffee on the small stove and a package from the local bakery on the table. "Deputy Chambers brought breakfast," he explained, "and news. They've located Blackwell. He's staying at the Helena Grand Hotel under an assumed name." Felicity's heart raced. "Are they arresting him?" "Marshal Daniels is gathering his men now. They'll move within the hour." Xavier poured coffee for them both. "Chambers will return to escort us to the federal building once Blackwell is in custody. You'll need to formally identify him and provide your testimony." The waiting that followed was agonizing. They ate little, both too tense for appetite, as the minutes stretched into an hour, then nearly two. When the expected knock finally came, Xavier moved to the door with his now familiar caution. But it wasn't Deputy Chambers who stood in the hallway. It was Attorney Grant, his expression grim and a cut visible above his right eye. "What happened?" Xavier demanded, helping the attorney inside and securing the door behind him. "Blackwell's men," Grant explained, accepting the cloth Felicity offered for his injury. "They ambushed the marshal's party at the hotel. There was gunfire. Daniels is wounded, though not critically. Chambers sent me to warn you Blackwell escaped in the confusion." Felicity felt ice in her veins. "Where would he go?" "That's the concern," Grant said. "He's cornered, desperate, and he knows you're the key witness against him. Chambers believes he might attempt to eliminate the threat you pose before fleeing the territory." Xavier's expression hardened. "He'll have to go through me first." "That's precisely what Chambers feared," Grant replied. "He's sending men here as we speak, but he wanted you prepared in case Blackwell's men arrive first." Xavier moved decisively, checking his pistol and retrieving his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "We need to move," he told Felicity. "This location is too exposed now that Blackwell knows we're working with the authorities." "Where can we go?" she asked, already gathering her few belongings. "The entire city could be dangerous." "The federal building," Grant suggested. "It's the most secure location, and there are armed deputies present at all times." Xavier nodded in agreement. "We'll take the back stairs and approach from the alley, less visible that way." The attorney's injury prevented him from accompanying them, but he provided detailed directions to the building's rear entrance, which was used primarily for transferring prisoners, and thus more heavily guarded than the public doors. They moved swiftly but cautiously, Xavier leading the way with his rifle ready and Felicity close behind. The alley behind Grant's office connected to a narrow passage between buildings, which would eventually lead them to the federal building's rear courtyard. They were halfway through this passage when Xavier suddenly halted, raising a hand in warning. Ahead, a figure appeared at the far end of the alley, a man in an expensive coat, flanked by two others with guns already drawn. "Miss Parker," the man called, his voice carrying an edge of false cordiality. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Even without having seen him before, Felicity knew immediately who addressed them. "Jacob Blackwell," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Xavier shifted position, placing himself more fully between Felicity and the threat. "That's close enough, Blackwell. Marshal Daniels has warrants for your arrest." "Daniels is in no position to enforce anything at the moment," Blackwell responded coolly. "And you, sir, are interfering in business that doesn't concern you." "It became my concern when your men shot at Miss Parker," Xavier replied, his rifle trained steadily on Blackwell despite the armed men beside him. "And it's federal business now." Blackwell's expression hardened. "I built everything I have from nothing. Fought Sioux and Weather and Eastern bankers who wanted to claim what I carved out of wilderness. I won't let a schoolteacher and a rancher destroy it all." "You destroyed it yourself," Felicity said, finding courage despite her fear. "When you decided the law didn't apply to you, when you had Judge Holloway murdered." A tense silence followed her words, broken only by the distant sounds of the city awakening around them. Xavier remained absolutely still, his attention divided between Blackwell and the armed men who flanked him. "I'm leaving the territory today," Blackwell finally said. "Nothing you can do will prevent that, but I can still decide whether you live to see tomorrow, Miss Parker." "That decision isn't yours to make," came a new voice from behind Blackwell. All eyes turned to find Deputy Chambers standing at the alley entrance, his pistol drawn and 3 other deputies positioned behind him. Marshal Daniels stood beside him, arm in a sling but his expression resolute as he leveled his own weapon at Blackwell's back. "Lower your weapons," Daniels ordered Blackwell's men. "You're surrounded." The standoff lasted only seconds before Blackwell's men, recognizing the futility of resistance, slowly placed their guns on the ground. Blackwell himself remained defiant, his gaze fixed on Felicity with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he promised as deputies moved forward to take him into custody. "Yes, it is," Marshal Daniels contradicted him, producing the formal arrest warrant. "Jacob Blackwell, you're under arrest for the murder of Judge William Holloway, land fraud, witness intimidation, and attempted murder. You'll stand trial here in Helena, where I imagine many of your former associates will be eager to testify against you to save their own skins." As Blackwell was led away, his final glare at Felicity contained all the malevolence of a man whose power had been irreparably broken. Yet she felt no fear now, only a profound relief that justice for Judge Holloway was finally being served. Xavier lowered his rifle, turning to her with concern. "Are you all right?" Felicity nodded, suddenly aware of how rapidly her heart was beating. "It's over," she said, the reality of it only now fully registering. "Truly over." Marshal Daniels approached them, his weathered face showing signs of pain from his wound but satisfaction in his eyes. "Thank you both. Your courage has brought down a man who's terrorized this territory for too long." "What happens now?" Xavier asked. "Blackwell will be held for trial. Given the evidence and Miss Parker's testimony, conviction is virtually certain." Daniels adjusted his injured arm with a grimace. "I'll need you to provide formal statements today, but after that, you're free to go. Your part in this is finished." The rest of the day passed in a blur of official procedures statements given, documents signed, formal identifications made. By late afternoon, Felicity and Xavier found themselves standing on the steps of the federal building, finally released from their obligations to the case that had brought them together. "What now?" Felicity asked, looking up at Xavier in the golden light of approaching sunset. His smile, rare and transformative, warmed her more than the spring sunshine. "Now we go home," he said simply, taking her hand in his, "if that's still what you want." "More than anything," she assured him, her heart full as they descended the steps together, leaving behind the dangers and uncertainties of the past weeks. They departed Helena the following morning, their horses rested, and supplies replenished for the journey back to Xavier's ranch. The trip that had been fraught with danger and evasion on their way to the city became almost leisurely on their return, with no need to avoid the main trails or travel in secrecy. They reached the ranch on the third day, cresting the final ridge as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Xavier halted his horse, Felicity stopping beside him as they gazed down at the small cabin and outbuildings nestled in the valley below. "It's not much," he said, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice. "Nothing like what you probably had in Boston." Felicity shook her head, her eyes taking in the peaceful scene, the cabin with smoke beginning to rise from its chimney, thanks to the ranch hand Xavier had asked a neighbor to send ahead, the corral where several horses grazed, the barn and small garden plot beside the house. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "It's home." The look Xavier gave her then contained everything words couldn't express: gratitude, tenderness, and a love that had grown from unexpected circumstances into something enduring and profound. As they rode down to the cabin together, Felicity reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her here. She had come west seeking purpose and adventure, never imagining she would find both in the most unexpected way, through danger and fever, through justice and courage, and through the steadfast heart of a man who had carried her through his gate and into a future brighter than either could have imagined alone. The minister from the nearest town came to the ranch 3 weeks later, performing a simple ceremony beneath the large oak tree beside the cabin. Wilkins and his men attended, as did Attorney Grant and Marshal Daniels, who brought news that Blackwell's trial was proceeding and conviction seemed certain. Felicity wore a new dress of pale blue, a wreath of wildflowers in her hair as she pledged her life to Xavier James before their small gathering of friends. His voice, usually so measured and calm, trembled slightly as he spoke his vows, his eyes never leaving hers as they promised to face whatever came together. That evening, as twilight settled over the land they now shared, Xavier stood with his wife on the porch of their cabin, his arm around her waist as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Happy?" he asked simply. Felicity leaned against him, contentment filling her as completely as the love that had grown between them. "More than I ever imagined possible," she assured him, turning in his embrace to meet his kiss, a kiss that held all the promise of the life they were building, day by day, together on the land that had brought them to each other. In the years that followed, their ranch prospered, expanding as Xavier's careful management and Felicity's organizational skills proved a formidable combination. They added rooms to the cabin as their family grew, first a son with his father's quiet strength, then twin daughters with their mother's determination and spirit. Felicity established a small school that served neighboring ranches and homesteads, fulfilling her calling as a teacher while raising her children in the freedom of the Montana wilderness. Xavier's reputation as a fair and honorable rancher spread throughout the territory, bringing opportunities and respect that his solitary former self could never have envisioned. Sometimes, on cool autumn evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful, they would sit together before the fire and marvel at the journey that had brought them to each other, a journey that began with fever and danger, but blossomed into a love story neither had been seeking, but both had desperately needed. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked once, years into their marriage. Leaving Boston, facing Blackwell, choosing this life, Felicity's answer came without hesitation, her hand finding his as it had countless times since that fateful day she collapsed at his gate. "Not for a single moment," she assured him. "This is where I was always meant to be, with you." And in the quiet of their home, surrounded by the life they had built together, they found the truth that had guided them from the beginning, that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to the most perfect destinations, and that love, when found in the midst of adversity, grows stronger with each passing day.